Our final speaker in today's conference on 1971 in Northern Ireland is Professor Niall O'Doherty. Niall is Personal Professor of Political Science and Sociology at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and he's published very extensively on the history and politics of the Northern Ireland conflict, and more generally on mediation, peace negotiations, and territorial conflict relating to a number of international conflict situations. His many publications include the seminal monograph Civil Rights to Armalites, Derry and the Birth of the Irish Troubles, first published by Cork University Press in 1997, and with a second edition with Palgrave Macmillan in 2005. And his most recent book, which emerged earlier this year, is Deniable Contact, Back-Channel Negotiation in Northern Ireland, which is published by Oxford University Press. So it's a great pleasure and privilege for me to introduce to you Professor Niall O'Doherty, who's going to give our plenary lecture on the subject of Crossing the Precipice, Northern Ireland, 1971.
Look, I want to thank Peter, first of all, for the invitation to speak today. I've been here for the whole conference. I've been lucky enough to have the time to listen to every paper, and I've really enjoyed it, and it's been really interesting. It's a period that I've been writing about for a long time. 30 years ago, I was writing about this period at a time before the official papers had been released and when we knew much less about it. So we have a much better understanding now of what was happening. What I'm going to look at today is a sequence of escalation that took place in the early months of 1971, with a view to saying something more general about the factors that drove Northern Ireland over the precipice in 1971, and something more general about the nature of escalation and the dynamics of escalation. In one of his publications on conflict in Northern Ireland, the late and much missed Professor John Darby of the University of Ulster and later of Notre Dame recalled a darkly humorous quip that circulated in the early 1970s and that gave me the title for this lecture. Northern Ireland never went over the precipice, it was said, because they kept moving the precipice. And even when it was most intense, there were those who played down the scale of conflict. But by any benchmark that might have been considered reasonable when civil rights marches began in 1968, Northern Ireland did indeed go over the precipice in the autumn of 1971, plunging into large-scale civil conflict. Between then and 1990, this conflict dwarfed all other situations of political violence in Western Europe, accounting for half of all deaths in Western Europe due to political violence in the 70s and 80s. The pivotal moment is easily identified, the night of internment, the 9th of August, 1971. Internment split the year into two lopsided halves, the 7 months that preceded it and the 5 months afterwards. I'll just talk briefly about the image here on the first slide. It's of British soldiers during a search operation in Ardoyne in North Belfast in February 1971. It's an important moment in the sequence of escalations. But the photograph it's there because it gives a sense of the visibility and impact of the British military presence in Catholic working class areas in 1971. So as I said, internment splits the year into two lopsided halves. This is a chart I put together very quickly based on Malcolm Sutton's index of deaths. And on the left, we see killings that took place between January and July 1971 in the first 7 months, and on the right, in those that took place in the final 5 months of the year between August and December. It shows the distinction clearly. Killings in the first 7 months numbered in the low dozens. In the final 5 months, they soared into triple figures. The chart shows the agencies that killed in those two uneven portions of the year. Even before internment, from January to July 1971, the Provisional IRA was accounting for around half of all fatalities. It also shows how dominant the British Army was as a combatant force at this time, accounting for around a quarter of the killings in both periods. Indeed, between August and December 1971, the British Army killed around 2 people for every 3 people killed by the Provisional IRA. So it's a period in which the British Army is very much to the fore. Loyalists, in contrast, barely registered until they killed 15 people in the bombing of McGurk's Bar in Belfast in December 1971. And the Loyalists are in orange there at the top of the bar chart. And that representation of Loyalists also illustrates some of the difficulties with using killings as a measure of violent activity, because most of the Loyalist toll there in 1971 is accounted for by this single attack. I've made one adjustment to the figures. I removed those killed by their own bombs. And these deaths are usually included in the toll of those killed by paramilitaries. But they're not killings in the same sense as the other fatalities. But I'm happy to discuss the logic of this afterwards. So the chart brings home the massive surge in violence that followed internment. But even so, it greatly underestimates the steepness of the escalation. And can we go back to slide 3, if that's possible? Yeah, so this is a chart from an article by sociologist Gianluca Di Fazio, who has mapped both killings and all acts of violence by those involved, including Republican paramilitaries. What the chart shows, and this is a chart of Republican killings in red and violent acts by Republican paramilitaries in black between July 1969 and December 1972. Now you see that sharp jump in the summer of 1971, and particularly after August 1971. But what's notable is the big gap that opens up between the number killed and the number of attacks carried out, so that non-fatal violence surged even more dramatically than killings before realigning by the middle of 1972. It's an indicator of a kind of what we might call a surplus of violence. It illustrates a large scale of the gun battles, the opportunistic attacks, including sniping and bomb attacks, rather than more carefully planned operations that were more likely to lead to fatalities. It's partly a measure of the increased autonomy exercised by local IRA units in a more chaotic, fast-moving environment. But it also highlights a certain lack of central IRA control and hints at the uncontrolled and indeed uncontrollable character of the escalation that took place in 1971. The failure of the British government to reorder the structures of government in Northern Ireland after troops were deployed in 1969, the resistance of Unionists and Loyalists to any such reordering, and the consequent aggravating presence of the British Army as the primary agent of state power in working-class Catholic areas are all important factors in explaining escalation in 1971. But the role of the IRA, of the Provisional IRA, was central too. It's the primary focus of much scholarship on the period, and it's the main focus of my discussion here. In explaining the role of the IRA in escalation, scholars and commentators often cite IRA Chief of Staff Sean McStaffon's account in his 1973 memoir. The IRA's plan, he wrote, was to move from area defense to combined defense and retaliation, and then what he called a third phase, an all-out offensive action against the British occupation system. His account is often accepted at face value, as evidence that if Northern Ireland went over the precipice in 1971, it was because the IRA pushed it over, moving on to the third phase of their plan as intended. It's a problematic explanation for the escalation of violence, not least because the old military adage that no plan survives contact with the enemy is doubly relevant in the case of a non-state armed group with far less robust organizational structures than a state. There's strong evidence that actions on the ground in Belfast and Derry in 1970 and 1971 were not susceptible to tight control by the leadership, even by the local leadership. Escalatory actions were sometimes carried out by IRA members with little regard to overall strategic objectives. In some cases, these actions ran counter to the strategic plans of the leadership, and on occasion offered a direct challenge to that leadership. The new recruits who poured into the Belfast IRA frequently resisted central control and direction, and they did so with some success. When the president of Provisional Sinn Féin, Rory O'Brothy, made a mild public criticism of IRA units which had fired at Protestant workers leaving a factory in Belfast, he was publicly rebuked by the Belfast IRA. In his memoir, former IRA volunteer Jerry Bradley recounts how IRA Chief of Staff Sean McStefan, at a meeting with IRA volunteers in Belfast, sought to exert his authority and assert the position of the national leadership by disciplining an IRA volunteer for losing his weapon. The assembled volunteers mutinied, saying they would resign en masse if the penalty was enforced. The Chief of Staff was forced to back down. IRA leaders were rebuffed too when they tried to reduce street violence. Gerry Adams recalls in his 1996 memoir, Before the Dawn, that, and I quote, local Republicans got involved in the Ballymurphy riots in 1970 in a serious attempt to create a situation of popular conflict with the British occupying forces. The Republican leadership, on the other hand, were against it and sent up a group to stop it. And these IRA people from outside were actually stoned out of Spring Hill by the young people who resented their intervention. There's a need for caution then when attributing developments on the ground to the strategic or even the tactical planning of the IRA leadership, or explaining escalation as the unfolding of a plan. I want now to trace the sequence that led up to a key moment of escalation in 1971, the crossing of a significant threshold. This was the killing by the IRA in March 1971 of 3 Scottish soldiers, already referred to in some of the previous presentations. And I want to draw out some of the factors propelling this escalation in order to contribute to a broader understanding of the dynamics of escalation during 1971. So on the 9th of March 1971, 5 months to the day before internment, IRA volunteers got into conversation with 3 off-duty Scottish soldiers in a city centre bar. The soldiers were brothers John and Joseph McCaig and Dougal McCaughey, aged 17, 18, and 23 respectively. And their ages, their youth would be a focus of much of the coverage. The IRA men invited them to go with them to Kelly's Cellars, a bar on the western and predominantly Catholic edge of the city centre, which had been a meeting place for the United Irishmen in the 1790s. From there, they drove them to a hillside above the city, where they shot them dead by the side of the road. There was near universal recognition of the transgressive and indefensible character of these killings. That recognition is evident in a myth that gained traction among sections of the nationalist minority, that loyalist extremists had carried it out to discredit the IRA. Gerald Scarf's cartoon in the Sunday Times, published at the end of that week, captures the political and public impact. The next slide, please, Peter. The blood from the 3 crosses on the hillside on the left, representing the 3 soldiers, flows into a reservoir filling with blood, increasing the pressure on a dam that's about to burst over the peaceful rural landscape below. Scarf's metaphor is of a dam about to burst rather than a precipice, but it conveys the same message of Northern Ireland on the verge of a sudden and catastrophic escalation. There's a broad consensus that this action was carried out by IRA members based in Ardoyne in the north of the city, unauthorised by the leadership of the Belfast IRA or the national leadership, but perhaps carried out with the authorisation of local commander Martin Meehan, who remained an IRA stalwart over the following decades. The killings had immediate political effects, as discussed in previous papers, triggering the resignation of Unionist Prime Minister James Chichester Clark 10 days later, stoking mobilisation by militant loyalists, and sharply intensifying demands for internment. The killings are especially striking because just 6 weeks earlier, IRA leaders and British military officers had been meeting secretly and cooperating to reduce street violence in West Belfast. Those meetings were part of a longer-term pattern of pragmatic cooperation based on limited shared interests. In a meeting of senior army officers with Home Secretary Reginald Maudling in January 1971, Frank Kitson, the brigade commander in Belfast, who had himself met with IRA leaders, explained the motivation. With the force levels available in Belfast, he told Maudling, it was necessary to keep some areas quiet in case all of them went wrong simultaneously. So when troops were first deployed in August 1969, contact and limited cooperative relationships were established between the Army and Republicans. Those links came under increasing pressure throughout 1971. One of the most important sources of pressure was internal division within the newly founded Provisional IRA. I think two interrelated lines of division were important. The first was territorial. West Belfast was the heartland of the new Provisional IRA and the home base of the commander of the Belfast Brigade, Billy McKee. But North Belfast, where a number of small nationalist areas were interlocked with loyalist areas, was also very active. There's scattered evidence to suggest that some IRA members in North Belfast, especially in Ardoyne, regarded the IRA leadership as insufficiently aggressive and sought ways to pressure them into escalation. There's a biography of Ardoyne IRA leader Martin Meehan by Joe Graham that has been the focus of some controversy and has to be treated with a certain skepticism. But there are certain claims that ring true or that reflect an understanding that seems to fit with other evidence. So he asserts that Meehan and other Republicans from Ardoyne helped to stoke escalation in West Belfast in August 1969 by initiating the burning of a car dealership on the Lower Falls. And his account conveys a kind of a frustration with a lack of aggression by the leadership in West Belfast, or the idea that they're not aggressive enough. So this was intertwined with a generational gap between older IRA leaders such as Billy McKee, who had experience of a very limited IRA campaign in the 1950s, and a new generation of younger IRA members who had extensive experience of street rioting and violent confrontation, first of all with the RUC and then with the British Army. So after British troops were deployed in August 1969, IRA leaders held their volunteers back from attacking the troops for several months. One former member told journalist Eamon Malley that the leadership held its members back only with difficulty after the Falls Road curfew in July 1970. An IRA volunteer told Malley, "We wanted to go out and shoot Brits, but we weren't allowed to." The Provisional IRA did, however, engage in what the movement represented as defence of Catholic area against Loyalists. On 27 June 1970, the Ardoyne IRA, led by Martin Meehan, shot from the area at crowds from neighbouring Loyalist areas as rioting broke out around a contested Orange Parade, killing 3 Protestant men. The same day, rioting broke out in the Short Strand, an isolated nationalist enclave in East Belfast, as Loyalist marchers passed by the area. Billy McKee, officer commanding of the Belfast IRA, travelled across the city from West Belfast to lead what he and others considered to be a defence of the area against Loyalists, in which they shot dead 2 Protestant men, while one of their own group was shot dead, apparently by accident. McKee's decision to go to the Short Strand may have been aimed in part at demonstrating that the IRA in West Belfast and the older leadership were just as willing as those in Ardoyne to confront Loyalists as they had done earlier that day and act as defenders of Catholic areas. Despite the growing violence over the course of 1970, the Provisional IRA had still not authorised its members to carry out offensive attacks on British soldiers, and cooperative contacts continued into 1971. The escalation of violence that culminated in the killing of the 3 Scottish soldiers emerged directly from a breakdown in secret contacts between the IRA and the British Army. Gerry Adams offers an account of these contacts in his memoir Before the Dawn, which is consistent with other contemporary accounts, most notably that of the Sunday Times Insight team. He writes that the British Army and some senior Republicans, authorised by the national leadership, held confidential discussions and agreed that if the Brits stayed out of Ballymurphy, Republicans would quell the riots. And so after 7 months of continuous rioting, we local Republicans got hold of some of the key people involved in the riots and succeeded in calming the situation down. It was agreed too that there would be no military or police activity in the Clonard area where the talks were taking place. Local groups in which the Provisional IRA was dominant would maintain order locally. When this arrangement became public, Unionists applied pressure on the army to assert its authority in these areas. And a few days later, on the 3rd of February 1971, in an apparent response to Unionist pressure, the British Army cordoned off Clonard and the nationalist area of Ardoyne in North Belfast and carried out large-scale house searches. One military source told the Sunday Times Insight team that the aim was, and I quote, to cut the provisionals down to size and show that the army could, and again I quote, invade their areas at will. Next slide, please. This is armoured vehicles in February 1971, getting ready to go into Ardoyne to take part in that operation. And the next slide shows the image that I showed earlier. Those are troops in Ardoyne engaged in that operation. So again, this is a very early stage. This is February 1971. And what's notable, this is literally days after the army had been meeting with the IRA and cooperating to try and contain street violence. And it gives a sense of that, well, the feel of that military presence in the areas. Over the following 48 hours, violence spiraled. As rioting continued into a second day, the IRA attacked the soldiers. After a blast bomb was thrown at British soldiers in Ardoyne, they shot dead 28-year-old Barney Watt, a Catholic civilian who had been involved in the rioting but was not an IRA member. Gun battles then broke out, during which the army shot dead an IRA member, James Saunders. Then, at 2 a.m. on the nearby New Lodge Road, the Provisional IRA shot dead gunner Robert Curtis, the first British soldier to be killed in the conflict. 3 important thresholds had been crossed in rapid succession. The British Army killing a civilian in riots, still a relatively rare event at the time. The Army killing an IRA member, and then the IRA killing a British soldier for the first time. This violence was heavily concentrated in Ardoyne and nearby areas, and in the following 3 weeks, the IRA killed 3 members of the security forces in North Belfast. In the weeks before the killing of the 3 soldiers, there was then a quite intensely localized escalation in North Belfast and Ardoyne in particular. And their killings are very much form part of a sequence of escalation that has a very important local dimension to it. Now, again, I can't emphasize enough that this escalating sequence that became particularly intense in North Belfast was not the result of a planned offensive by the IRA, but emerged directly from the exposure and collapse of a secret cooperative agreement between the IRA and the army. In this context, I think the killing of the soldiers can be understood in part as an attempt by some more militant members in the north of the city to stimulate escalation that would draw the IRA leadership and other IRA units in Belfast into more aggressive action and into launching an offensive campaign, a determined offensive campaign. I have been told that someone close to the leadership of the IRA in Ardoyne at this time explained those killings in subsequent years by referencing the comments of Sean Tracy, an IRA commander in Tipperary during the War of Independence. Frustrated at the lack of militancy and the loose organization of the IRA in the county, Tracy had remarked at the end of 1918, "If this goes on, we'll have to kill someone and make the bloody enemy organize us." That is, in order to force a kind of more intensive, in order to force the IRA to organize and get involved in a campaign, it would be necessary to provoke strong state repression that would give the IRA no choice but to organize and become more effective. While the killing seemed at the time a singular act of horror that demonstrated above all the depravity of the killers, it was driven by broader intra-party struggles within the IRA, and as part of a sequence of escalation driven not primarily by the strategic logic of the leadership, but by the outworkings of internal struggles and pressures from below. In the terrorism literature, acts of violence are often analysed in terms of the strategic goals they are intended to advance. But this decisive act of violence in March 1971 was emphatically not part of a central strategy. It was, in effect, a local initiative that seems to be aimed at forcing the IRA leadership in a certain direction. Many years later, Martin Meehan said of the efforts of the IRA leadership to restrain its members during this period, and he made his remarks to BBC journalist Peter Taylor. He said, "It was like holding back a pack of wild horses. It was like the tide coming in. You couldn't stop it." He added, "I would say the leadership at that stage were in a war situation before they even realized it." If that was the case, Meehan and his fellow volunteers in Ardoyne played a crucial role in putting them in that situation. Non-state armed groups that lack the robust organizational structures of a conventional military or a sovereign state, particularly in the early stages of rapid growth, are especially susceptible to being driven by local forces that seek to force the pace. It suggests that the disjuncture and tensions between centre and local, identified by Stathis Kalivas in his study of violence during the Second World War in Greece, are central to explaining dynamics of escalation. Threshold crossing episodes of violence, such as the killing of the 3 soldiers, required relatively few resources and allowed a local unit to exercise disproportionate influence on the overall conflict. It shows how easily violence can escape the control of leaders and resonates with theorist of negotiation Ira Zartman's observation on the dynamics of escalation, which are on the next slide, please. Escalation is escalated, or sorry, conflict is escalated by a party, Zartman writes, but it also escalates by itself. There is an inherent tendency for escalation to proceed on its own, dragging the parties along and making decisions for them, engulfing them in unintended and inescapable consequences. Violence escalated in 1971 well beyond the intentions or expectations of those in charge. It was accelerated by the logic of swift retaliation, loose central control, and by what von Clausewitz calls the explosive forces inherent to violence. That is, the particular unpredictability and contingency of violence. Several years ago, I interviewed Billy McKee, who was commander of the Belfast Brigade of the IRA during this critical period until his arrest in April 1971. And he made a remark that strongly echoes Zartman and that perhaps reflects his own understanding of the limits of control at the time. Speaking of this early phase, he told me, and the quote is on the next slide, "Their war got out of hand and ours got out of hand too. We went hell for leather at each other." In 1971, Northern Ireland went over the precipice. By the mid-1970s, a large measure of state control had been restored, but the legacy of that transition to large-scale violence was a militant Republican movement that was deeply embedded, widely supported, and capable of sustaining a long-term, high-level threat to the state. When the IRA campaign ended in the 1990s, the militant Republican tradition that had first emerged as a significant force in 1970 and 1971 became a substantial mainstream political force, enjoying growing electoral success. One of the most important long-term outworkings of that decisive year of escalation in 1971 is the transformation in recent years of party politics in Ireland, both north and south of the border, with the emergence of Sinn Féin as a major electoral force, and most recently as the main opposition party in the Republic of Ireland. The political legacy of internment and that decisive year of escalation in 1971 continues to have an important shaping impact on political competition on both sides of the Irish border. And I'll finish by showing you a slide that I thought I would just mention if I had time. This is Martin Meehan, our Down IRA commander, in Derry, in Duke Street in October 1968. And it's sort of a slightly uncomfortable image for, you know, if you consider there to be a very sharp divide between the civil rights campaign and peaceful protest and subsequent escalation of violence. He's a figure who was central to that escalation in Belfast in 1971, but also participant on October 5th in Derry, where he was arrested by the RUC. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thank you very much, Niall, and apologies again for the technical issues we had at the start of your session, and thank you for your patience in waiting until we had that issue resolved. I hope it didn't undermine people's ability to see Niall's presentation and to hear it all the way through. So let's open it up to the floor for questions. So again, if you want to ask a question, press the raise hand icon. Craig Murray, I think, is first. Craig, do you want to go ahead?
Hi, thanks for that, Niall. That was a great talk, very, very interesting. What I was wondering, in your opinion, is with the nascent provisional IRA, with the relative unpredictability and localised control, particularly I'm thinking under Martin Meehan, would you say they were possibly a more dangerous and unpredictable organisation due to this lack of centralised control to the British, and obviously with their lack of experience and possible lack of intelligence sharing going on? They were more dangerous than when they became more organised in the later 70s, in the long war period, and the active service units come in, particularly in Belfast.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. So is it better for the state to have a more tightly, centrally controlled armed challenger, or one that's decentralized and less predictable? And the argument was made at the time that Frank Steele, who was mentioned in an earlier presentation, who was a crucial figure in the development of British policy, an MI6 officer, he told military officers in, I think it was 1972, that internment was counterproductive because it removed existing commanders and replaced them with less predictable, younger, inexperienced commanders. So that's an interesting reflection, that someone at the heart of British policy would say, leave the people in place, leave the more experienced people in place, because it becomes more uncontrolled and less predictable if you have a high turnover, and if these younger people want to force the pace. If they come into control, we'll have more problems and more difficulties. In the longer term, from the point of view of a paramilitary organization, ultimately you have a political goal, unless you're simply performing, unless it's simply to express a sense of alienation or aggression. You have a political goal, and political goals require control, central control, and some kind of strategic direction. And it might be in the interests of the state ultimately for a paramilitary organization to be able to pursue a political goal and go through a transition that would involve the ending of violence. So I think it's a complex one. I certainly don't think, was it more dangerous to the UK when it was less predictable? Yes and no. Obviously, as it becomes more organised, tighter, it's more capable of directing its violence more carefully and rationing it, if you like, storing it up and feeding out the violence gradually for political effect.
Thanks, now. Cheers.
Thank you, Craig. Jack is next.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Niall, for the paper as well. And I suppose my interest in this really is the internal dynamics of republicanism through 1971, which seemed to me to be, as you've sort of made us think a little bit about, seems to be quite different according to place, quite different according to hierarchy. I suppose what I'm interested in is that if the provisional movement sets itself up from late 69 as being fundamentally a defensive organisation, and that foundational story that it tells about the phoenix from the ashes of Bombay Street and all the rest. I suppose what's interesting to me is that late in 71, the Provisional Army Council says we are now, carrying forward an offensive struggle, and you get O'Connell and McStephon and all these kind of people publicising that. So I suppose my question is, how does 1971 drive that process forward? Because you've conveyed obviously a lot of the kind of chaos of republicanism on the ground and its kind of reactive side, but at the same time there's clearly an effort going on to try to in the kind of the model of the 50s movements that people like McStephon had admired in Cyprus, for example. There's clearly a desire to try and drive this forward to a much more cohesive, offensive, organised movement. I just wonder what you thought about that dynamic.
Yeah, well, I think after August 1971, they see for the first time that they might actually be able to achieve something. it's significant to me that their political demands, their political program, their political demands appear after internment. Who needed political demands in 1956 or 57 when you'd no possibility of being involved in some kind of transformative settlement? So I think the way I describe it is in part they run into a campaign, in part they're running into it, but in part they're being pushed into it, and in part they've sort of tripped into it. There's a combination of intent plus other forces propelling them, plus kind of accidental escalation. What they really wanted in early 1971 was more time to get ready, to prepare. They didn't feel ready. But when it starts, they think, oh, well, actually, we have this, mass mobilization on the streets here. It may be possible to convert this into political gains. But then what is their intention? I don't think we understand currently what they were doing in that period. I don't think that the main lines of academic debate adequately capture what was going on. And I think, there is an imperative back then, and there's some hints of it sort of emerge occasionally. There is an imperative to build a strong political organization. That preceded the War of Independence. The War of Independence started on the back of a mass electoral victory. So they're quite conscious in 1971, I think, that, my view is that they're conscious that, physical force without political electoral power is inadequate. And they need political power, they need electoral support. And there's an interesting comment by Rory O'Brody at one stage. He says they want to be part of talks, and someone says, well, how can you demand to be part of talks when you don't have any political representation and you don't have any political support? And he says, well, political support has not been tested at the polls since the last election, and our support has grown greatly since then. Which is a very early statement that that indicates, well, actually, electoral support is not something that he's dismissing. He's saying, well, actually, we have more than you realize we have. So I think they need a political movement, and I think in a way, the very fast precipitous escalation prevents them and delays them in developing an effective political wing.
Okay, thank you, Jack. Miley Brennan is next.
Hi, thank you so much for having this and putting this all together, Peter. For Dr. Dochartaigh, I just have a question because I'm studying a bit more of like the modern politics, and we've talked a lot about the impact that the specific year, 1971, had on Sinn Féin's politics, especially. How do you think like the centenary that's going on this year, as well as like this 50 years on commemoration, everything that happened with Ballymurphy, do you think that's having a widespread impact on politics today? Or do you think it's like the public memory is a bit more separate than everything that's happening post-Brexit?
Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer quickly. All my answers have been long, but for a long time, the Republic of Ireland did not want to commemorate the 1916 rebellion and was hesitant to celebrate the War of Independence because of the ongoing violence in the north, because of the campaign of the Provisional IRA. And several years after the Good Friday Agreement or the Belfast Agreement, the Irish state became more willing to commemorate and to celebrate. And I think there's an anxiety among Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil that Sinn Féin in the Republic of Ireland may benefit from those kind of celebration and commemoration of the War of Independence by connecting the Provisional IRA campaign to that earlier campaign. But at the same time, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil themselves want to claim ownership of this period of 1919 to 21. They don't want to condemn or disown it because then you hand it over to Sinn Féin. You hand over the kind of the foundational struggle from which the independent Irish state emerged. So I think there are interesting tensions there. But I teach I teach Irish politics, and I teach Irish politics in the Republic and the politics of the North to my students, and I ask them a lot about their views. And you have a huge surge of support to Sinn Féin in the last couple of years. It's particularly strong among students, but they associate them very much with more radical policies on housing, on health, on employment, on public provision. I'm not so sure the kind of commemoration of 1921 or looking back to 1971 is that significant in terms of them getting the support of younger people, but it's clearly an important part of their sort of identity and sense of continuity.
Okay, thank you, Miley. Aaron?
Thanks, Peter. Thank you very much for your paper, Niall. It's an invitation to elaborate a little bit more on a couple of points that I noticed that you had touched upon, but I just wanted to invite you to sort of fill in some gaps for me. So you mentioned that in your paper that Kitson met with the IRA. I mean, he didn't particularly have a good view of either wing of the IRA at that time. He said that he believed that, while people in the battalion levels and above in the IRA and the provisionals were trying to relate what they were doing militarily to an overarching political objective, that was his reading of it. That those lower down were simply drunk and sitting and talking about military activities in social clubs. So that was his view, but I wonder if some of that source material that I'm looking at actually hides more than it reveals, and in fact, he really did see the whites of his enemy's eyes. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, and also in terms of talking to the IRA, who are we specifically talking about? Are we talking about Frank Steele and MI6, British intelligence, or are we talking about the army? Who and according to the evidence that you're bringing out today, are talking to the IRA? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. In late January 1971, it is senior British military officers, and there's a document that you're probably familiar with where, after this all comes into the open, there's unionist pressure to clamp down on the IRA rather than to talk to them. Reginald Maudling visits, and he meets all these senior officers from Derry, who are based in Derry as well as in Belfast and elsewhere. He says, what exactly is going on? And they all say, well, yeah, we talk to these people, we talk to vigilantes, often it's the IRA. And that's a very illuminating document, and the Kitson quote is from that document. And I guess their point, they're all unified on the point that it's a pragmatic adaptation to circumstances, that the Republicans are a significant force in these Catholic working class areas, and they meet with them. There's this very limited, uneasy shared interest, but it's a shared interest nonetheless for reasons that are not immediately obvious. So it's not dependent on Kitson's view of the IRA or whether he has any regard for them. From his point of view, it's operationally sensible to avoid having to deal with disorder throughout the city, breaking out all over the city at the same time and creating circumstances where they would lose control. And I guess arguably that's what happened on internment night on the 9th of August, that in Kitson's terms, all of Belfast went bad, as he would put it, and it did, make it uncontrollable and unmanageable.
I suppose the reason why I asked the question is that they have formed on this a few years earlier in Aden. They do something similar where they try to control. This is the army. They try to control the situation, but unfortunately, because the information hasn't been shared because of the need to know principle, that you know, the sort of the interaction with the army lower down causes the violence to move elsewhere. So could you see that? You know, could you put that particular emphasis on the documentation too, that they tried to control it, but the information didn't filter down or didn't find its way to the different agencies, and therefore there wasn't a comprehensive plan here. It was simply doing whatever they could to limit the violence. Could that be another explanation for the
sure. I don't. Yeah, I don't see it as a comprehensive plan, but as a sort of day-to-day, you know, management of the situation. And you do occasionally get the senior military commanders, as you know, saying, you know, we're just, you know, there needs to be some kind of political resolution of this situation. We're just here. All we can do is offer kind of temporary control while a solution is put in place. That's a very common theme in late 1969 and 1970. But yeah, I mean, what else would I say about that? It's absolutely routine. The Sunday Times Insight team were the first one to break this at the time. They provide a detailed account of what was going on. And in terms of sharing information, the information was deliberately withheld from the RUC. And in fact, the secret was broken by, I think, 2 RUC officers walked into Clonard and were approached by civilians who told them, you're not meant to be in here. There's an agreement that you don't come in here. And the RUC officers then went to nearby British soldiers seeking confirmation, and the soldiers confirmed what the civilians had told them, that they weren't supposed to be there. And that information then went to unions. Now, I mean, to me, it looks like those RUC officers heard about the agreement. Somebody heard about the agreement, and they went in there in order, as a kind of a test case, in order to prove it. And then the information was fed to unionist politicians. So it was deliberately withheld from the RUC. Or, well, deliberately withheld. Those RUC officers at least professed not to know about it.
That's great, thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. Margaret, do you have your hand up to ask a question, or is that a residual hand icon?
It's residual. It's
okay.
Residual. Sorry. I can ask a question if
yeah, as you're online, why not?
Sorry, it's an odd kind of a question, really. What you're talking about is it the huge gap between the O'Brothies, the McStephens, all of the so-called political leadership and the people on the ground in Belfast. So I wonder, would you like to say something about that? So, you know, what their leadership does is allows this movement to have a shape that's political, I suppose. But without them, you know, what exactly is the IRA in Belfast at this time? You know, what is its political voice? Or, sorry, I don't know if that's clear, Niall.
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question, and it goes to the heart of what's going on. And what sets this manifestation of the IRA and this IRA campaign out from any other IRA campaign. Like, when did the IRA ever launch a campaign after large-scale civil disorder had broken out? I mean, that's not what happens. The 1916, 1919, you know, the subsequent IRA campaigns in the 40s or 56, they're all kind of elite, driven by a central leadership. They're not propelled from below by mass disorder on the streets. So this is completely unlike any other manifestation of the IRA. It's something where the social forces and the ground level forces are much more important. So that's the first thing. And I interviewed Rory O'Brothaigh many years ago, and I remember him telling me about he went into Derry in July 1971 after Seamus Cusack and Desmond Beatty were shot dead by troops. And I remember he described the meeting, and I remember him shaking his head, and he just said, people there were so angry, you know, at that meeting. They were so angry. And it was like it had, you know, hit him. So like, that's not what the IRA of the 50s experienced or of the 40s, like going into a city which was in complete ferment, in which the level of popular anger and of widespread sort of fury was something that by which a senior, not quite taken aback, but stunned by the level of anger that was expressed. So they're operating in a situation where the sort of the social forces from below are much more influential and much more powerful than they were during previous attempts to launch campaigns. And as to what the Belfast IRA would have been without that leadership, there are hints of this. I think it's in Joe Cahill's memoir, or is it a biography of him? I think it's in there that he talks about when they got together in August 1969, that they were going to set up a new organization. They weren't going to call it the IRA. They were going to choose a different name. And then that strand of people who sort of responding to immediate circumstances in Belfast, who are not even intending to use the name of the IRA, become a major strand within the new provisional IRA. And so there's a blending of different forces. But I think that's really telling that some of those, the people who mobilized in what they regarded as defense in August 1969, that they considered a new organization that would break with that title.
Thanks so much. That's really interesting.
Thanks, Margaret. Okay, so we might take our last question from Karen.
Hello, sorry to keep asking questions. I was interested, it's just something I've been trying to work out. I'm doing my PhD, as I mentioned earlier, on observation posts from the Shankill Falls Divide, and I've been reading Kitson's book, Counterinsurgency, Subversion, and so on. And I'm baffled as to why he left in April 72 and what the implications of that were in relation to the covert observation posts, which he talks about in his book. He talks about using them in other post-colonial, in colonial situations in Aden and in Kenya and so on. He gives these examples of covert observation positions, and then they all sort of start to appear after Operation, or during and after Operation Motorman. And I'm wondering whether Kitson's influence reduced or increased after he left April 72, because I believe he was then trained at the military academies in England and so on. So I don't know exactly. I wonder if you could shed some more light on the circumstances surrounding his departure as a general, as a commander, and related to that, I've read those tactical retrieval cell documents where he's talking about how the initiative lies largely with the IRA in December 71, and I think that may still be the case. I'm not sure in December 72, but whether this was linked somehow to his, what the relationship between his departure and these events of Operation might have been. Sorry to ramble on there.
Yeah, no, that's the interesting questions, and some other people here may be better positioned to answer the question about Kitson leaving in April 1972. But I do have a few things to say that might be useful, and there's really interesting discussion of Kitson in the evidence to the Bloody Sunday inquiry, and one officer describes him as, although he was brigade commander in Belfast, he was just one of 3 brigade commanders. But they said, everybody knew Kitson was significant, and this person said he was the sun around which the other planets revolved. And that would indicate, one reason why his legacy might have remained significant beyond his departure, that he might have informed policy not just in his own brigade area, but at a higher level. And, there was a kind of informal hierarchy in which his position was a bit... he had more respect and more influence than his position might suggest. In terms of the covert posts, there's a book I read many years ago called From the Crater to the Cregan, which is by a British officer. The crater is in Aden, and the Cregan in Derry, obviously. So he'd served in Aden, and many of his troops had as well, and then they're in Cregan. And he describes, with pride, really, the amount of covert observation posts they managed to establish in the estate, and dozens of them in a single working class housing estate, quite extraordinary. Yeah, and those covert posts are just really, they're fascinating. Can you imagine, like, a housing estate with 20 secret, soldiers secretly positioned throughout the estate? Incredible stuff. Yeah, I hope that's someone like Aaron might know a bit more about your question on Kitson leaving in April 1972, whether there's any, significance to that.
Thank you very much. I'll check out that reference. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. We've heard our speakers over the last few hours approach this crucial year in Northern Irish history, 1971, from a number of different perspectives: high and street politics, strategy and tactics of the army and insurgents, popular memory and individual memory, campaigns for justice, popular culture. And we've had everything wrapped up with a scintillating plenary by Niall on the dynamics of escalation in 1971 and why this is such a crucial year in the development of the Troubles and everything that looks from that. I'd like on behalf of the Institute of Irish Studies to thank all our speakers who've given up their time to share their research and their perspectives on 1971 with us today. It's very deeply appreciated. We do intend to get rid of some of the technical glitches and edit a version of today's proceedings, which we'll make available through the web pages of the Institute of Irish Studies for those of you who were unable to attend all of today's proceedings. So before we finish, could I perhaps ask everyone who's still with us to unmute themselves and give our speakers a round of applause in the traditional fashion.